Thank you, Ammar, so much for joining me. Ammar is an intimidatingly smart old friend of mine. He got his PhD in history, where he worked on communist thought in India, is kind of an intellectual historian. And then, he taught at government college, Punjab University, Forman Christian College in all in Lahore. And now he's a member of Haqooq Khalq. I stumbled over that. It's late. Haqooq Khalq.
A
Uh,
lot of people.
yeah, so I don't think you need much of an introduction beyond that. One of the difficulties that I have, especially in describing Pakistani politics to people who ask about it, is to try to sort of see Pakistan's trajectory over the last decade or so, and describe it in terms of the main parties in power and how they've been jockeying for power, etc., etc. And so I guess one question that it's a really hard question for me, so I don't know if it's easier for you, but if how does one evaluate political parties in existence in Pakistan?
Well, I mean, I think over time, what's happened is, particularly over the last 30 years, there's been a dual crisis for political parties. One is that when we were growing up in Lahore, you remember there was this anti-politics sentiment that was very much manufactured by the military establishment. So one of the unique features of Pakistan is that political parties are always clashing with the establishment, and by which we mean mostly the military. And that dialectic that has given Pakistani politics its drama, its impulse, its peculiarity. So that's I think a very key component of understanding politics. What has happened, unfortunately, is that not only has the establishment over the last 30 years managed to delegitimize politics as such by claiming that it's because of these parties that we have to compromise, and instead we can have a military government or a dictatorship where we can push policies more easily. And the policies that they've been wanting to push have, of course, been formed in Washington and World Bank manuals and IMF structural adjustment programs. But on the other hand, political parties themselves have lost a lot of credibility because they've failed to offer a viable alternative. And I think what we're seeing right now is the convergence of this dual crisis of the party form in Pakistan. And the tragedy is that we're fighting for the constitution even in 2020. We're fighting for basic rule of law, basic division of separation of powers. Political parties, even of the left, and by left I mean center left, because you rightly pointed out we don't have a CPM kind of a party in Pakistan. They're actually trying to preserve the status quo. They're trying to ensure that the system does not get completely decimated. The constitution doesn't get decimated. Whereas, ironically, it is the right wing which is talking about radical change, and it has captured the latent anger of the people. And this is a very dangerous reversal. So the left or the liberals are now a force of conservatism. They're saying, we need to defend civil liberties, defend this, defend that. It's all a very defensive position in the midst of complete decay. So the ground that they're trying to protect is actually already getting more and more thin, whereas the language of transformation has been monopolized by the right. And that, I think, makes it very difficult for the mainstream parties to instill enthusiasm amongst its supporters, because it's all about following policies that have already been made elsewhere, whether in Washington and now increasingly with China, CPEC, Chinese Communist Party. So there is nothing new that's being offered by political parties in Pakistan, and I think that's why the party form itself is on the decline. The only people who are offering a new deal is the religious right, and that's scary.
The leftist critique of all political parties is it dependent on the party that is in power, and does it sort of rely on the, or does it need to rely on like a holistic critique of all mainstream political parties in Pakistan? Because I don't see much of the latter. I see a lot of the former. Even within leftist circles, there's a lot of, whichever party is in power and with the establishment, that is the party that is lambasted, right? The overall holistic critique that you pointed out is lacking, no?
Yes and no. I think part of the reason, and that's something very difficult to explain to friends, ideologically minded friends abroad, on why the government has to be the target in a place like Pakistan. So let's say in the US, there's this claim, if you don't support Biden, then you get Trump. Now, that argument does not work in the same way in Pakistan. It's different also because in Pakistan, if we have a Trump, by which we mean someone who is really supported by the military establishment or is ruthless towards opponents, maybe not as stupid as him, but although right now we can claim to be competing in that department as well. But if there's a person like him, then when we say we're speaking to the opposition, it also means we're trying to protect ourselves and our cadres from getting abducted, from even being shot at, from being fired from universities, from being threatened. Increasingly, there are rape threats and families are being targeted. So speaking to the opposition becomes a necessity, and that's something that it was very hard for us to explain when we met Bilawal a few months ago, and he came to my house and we welcomed him, not because we didn't have a critique that we completely gave up on our critique of Bilawal. We 2 weeks before he arrived, I had written a scathing critique of the PPP in the News International. But the reason we had to meet him is because a couple of our students had been abducted, and we needed someone to raise that issue in the Senate and in the National Assembly. Mm-hmm. So it's that kind of vulnerability, which is a very serious part of political calculation here. So you have to, people speak to even intelligence officers all the time. So in a situation in which getting killed is not just a theoretical possibility, it's very much something that's happening around you. It's happened, and abductions have happened to our group, and it's happened to me as well briefly. In such a situation, one has to be very realistic about how one moves forward and who all one can antagonize. Failure of opposition, failure to imagine a different kind of an alternative, an alternative program, and an alternative socioeconomic vision. And that thing, in that sense, Pakistan is very similar to many other countries in the region, including, India, where part of the reason that you have such a powerful political force, a fascist political force, is because the traditional parties were thoroughly discredited. Mm-hmm. And they were not saying anything new at a time when there was pervasive anger in society. So who captures that latent anger is where the politics of the future will be. And so far, the mainstream parties have only focused on fighting the monsters. Mm-hmm. But that's a negative position. It's a position of negation, that you are, against Trump, against Modi, against Imran Khan. Yeah. But what are you for? Yeah. And what they're for is often not as inspiring as what they're against. And that's part of the problem.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about HKM and your involvement in it, its trajectory over the last few years, etc.
So we left the AWP in 2017, and part of our disagreement with the existing left was that many of the old leaders were finding it very hard to relate to new themes that were coming up in left politics, which included not only feminist politics and uh, youth politics, different kinds of youth politics, the struggles of Pashtuns and Baloch, so these oppressed nationalities or ethnic minorities. But also, I think the old left had this tendency to uh, monopolize social movements, to
Mm.
think that solidarity basically means that they will eventually join our party or join our organization. Whereas in a moment such as ours, the situation is too fluid, and you have to accept that all you know about the situation is that things from the past are no longer working, but you haven't really clarified what the alternative is. So we are in an experimental period,
Mhm.
which means that we're in potentially a very creative period. And in such a situation, we have to give up on this notion that uh, politics is a science with certain formulas. I think politics in such situation becomes something of an art, where you're part of this very creative, novel process of imagining an alternative praxis. So we formed the People Solidarity Forum, and began working with different movements, giving solidarity, as the name suggests. Um, and In that period, we particularly focused on the youth. So I was teaching at government college from where I was fired in 2017, and I went to Punjab University. There were other activists who were very active with young people, and by May 2018, we launched the HKM right before the elections as a movement putting pressure on candidates, political candidates, to implement or talk about the constitutionally guaranteed rights of citizens. They said we are going to do a counter election campaign. So not like asking people not to participate in elections, but encouraging people to ask difficult questions to their candidates. And it got noticed, and a lot of young people joined us during that period. And since then, we've organized or participated in organizing, the student solidarity marches. Student solidarity with the Audit March. There was also the Shahri Tahaffuz March we did, which was against police brutality, for which there was repression on us too. Um, and for the last 6 months, I think we've grown quite a bit in terms of our network. Since COVID, most political parties just basically disappeared. And we started this labor relief campaign, which was to provide relief to workers who had been laid down uh, by factories mostly. So, over almost 1 million workers were laid off during this period, and we were trying to reach as many as we could. We reached about 5 or 6 thousand families during this period, and at the same time, we worked with health workers in particular who went on hunger strike in Lahore. So that was a period in which we were working very closely with doctors, and then with lawyers who were fighting for civil liberties, and some of our own people were incarcerated during this period. So we got them out through the help of some very good lawyers of the Supreme Court. So we've been very active, and in the last 1 month, we worked very closely with a number of trade unions. And right now, the debate is whether we want to bring this all together on a single platform, which means a political party, or should we continue to deepen our work in these different movements? And that's a very serious debate to be had, because eventually the limitation of movements is that there's a lot of euphoria when they're happening, but eventually politics is also about time, about sustaining the momentum beyond the euphoria. And for that, you need an organization, you need people who can endure in the lessons of the movement beyond its own expiry date. So that's the kind of debate we're having within HKM, and I think it's a productive debate to have.
The question, I guess, it might be an unanswerable question, but the question as to how to build power and build movement and knit labor increasingly into the political organizing structure, how does that work? And how do you mitigate the negative aspects of this fractiousness while maintaining that dissent in the ranks is part of the deal, right?
Worry too much about uh, divisions within the left. I think it can be very toxic, but it can also be productive if people engage with each other in a decent way. If they're actual intellectual disagreements, I don't think they should be repressed for some kind of a mythical unity. Also, because what's at stake, I think, in terms of unity, is not that much. Even if the entire Pakistani left united, I don't think they can pose any serious challenge. And I don't think the question for us should be to unite the left. The question for us should be to unite the people.
Mm-hmm.
We need organizations that work on bringing together movements that are focused on bringing together the concerns of disparate movements, trying to build something commonality between very seemingly different kinds of struggles. And those are the kinds of platforms that need to be built, because at this point the big question of politics is translation. How do we translate these very different kinds of registers onto like a common united political project? And that I find to be a more difficult and a more necessary project to undertake, as compared to bringing the entire left stream together. Because really, I mean, even if you bring all of them together, most likely, if you bring 5 parties together, they'll split and turn into 10 parties, and there's hardly any political lesson in that. On the other hand, I think it's very important for leftists to keep engaging with each other, even if there's disagreement. Not only because you often see each other on the ground in common struggles, but also because I think ideological debates do clarify a lot in terms of strategic thinking, in terms of tactics, in terms of long-term vision. And oftentimes, ideological debates are dismissed as some kind of an intellectual utopia, disconnected from the public, and people aren't. And that's, I think, both an unfair characterization of the left and also a very patronizing way of looking at the people, because the people are actually very interested in ideological debates in a very different register, in a very different language. But this idea that ideology is only the concern of intellectuals is simply not true. All human beings are also ideological beings.
Right.
And we all participate in ideology. So clarifying what kind of an ideological line can help us move forward, can help shift the balance of forces, I think it's a very legitimate debate to have, and we should encourage it.
How do you account for solidarity and labor and the working class, and the working class and labor? You alluded to how you're working during the pandemic with factory workers, etc. But where's the rural side of this equation?
The left historically focused a lot on the countryside, and there was an entire Maoist tendency within the left, which was particularly interested in organizing the peasantry.
Yeah.
And recently, we're very heartened to know that the leader of the Pokhara military farms, Meher Abdul Sattar, was recently released after 4 years in imprisonment. So this was one of the most inspiring peasant movements in Punjab. This was a land that was owned by the military, and they tried to displace hundreds of thousands of people from these lands about 20 years ago. And the peasants just resisted. They went to court, and they realized that the military was actually occupying the land illegally for the last 70 years. There are all these other struggles happening, for example, in due to coal power plants. Similarly, you have struggles against climate change in southern Punjab, where the cotton crop is getting destroyed because of change. So now I think that there's a new kind of rural politics happening, which is very much integrated into these global processes, very much integrated into national politics. Because according to some sociologists, now it's only like about 55 to 60% of Pakistan is either urban or what they call peri-urban, which means that even within urban, even within rural settings, people are intimately connected to industry and even culture of the city. So you don't really have those kinds of peasant communities that one talked about in the 1940s, 50s, 60s that were removed from the cities, and then the capital would come from the cities and try to be intrusive. Now it's all integrated in a very complex way. So any kind of urban politics has a deep impact on rural politics. And look at this movement, the Pashtun Tahaffuz movement, which is a big movement of Pashtuns against the violence of the military and the war on terror. Now, these are all people from tribal areas. So this is one of the most removed areas, not just geographically, but also in our imagination. I mean, growing up in Lahore, we didn't really think too much about where FATA was, or where the border with Afghanistan, except we were watching it just like people in Lahore were watching it, just like people in the US were watching it. It's that far removed. But that is a place that has produced the most eloquent and articulate critique of the Pakistani state, steeped in the language of constitutionalism, steeped in the language of human rights, steeped in the language of democracy. So it's a very fascinating phenomenon that you have a lot of these young people who studied in these universities, but who actually belong to rural areas or tribal areas. And they are providing a new language to even understand human rights. They are the ones who are today giving an impetus to the entire movement, and the old human rights activists are actually trying to catch up. So the politics is changing. So I think that divide no longer works in the way it used to. The peripheries are very much participating within national and even international politics, because PTM is very much part of international geopolitics. But even the Okara peasant movements in Punjab was very quickly accused of being Indian agents.
You've gone through these many processes and your own experiences as well, but what is the state of higher education in Pakistan right now, and what are the major actors and systems that we should be locating our descent towards?
Well, universities in Pakistan, perhaps everywhere, but in Pakistan, they present a peculiar problem. One is that a lot of young people are now entering higher education. So it's unprecedented. But we don't have the infrastructure to give them quality education or to even give them jobs. So the aspirations of young people have changed. Let's say a peasant's son is now a graduate of Punjab University. At the same time, he realizes that he neither has a job in the city because he's underconnected, nor does he want to go back being a peasant because his aspirations have changed. And that means your past and your future both have failed you. And at some level, for such people, time itself dissolves. And that I find to be a very common feature of a lot of young people, how they're experiencing time, this complete dissolution of time. On the other hand, after Pakistan signed the last IMF deal, there was a 40% budget cut. And recently, the HEC chairman, Tariq Banori, he said this is the worst financial condition ever for the Higher Education Commission. So universities are in the worst financial situation ever. And this is under a party that claimed to be a party of the youth.
Yeah.
And the third thing, peculiar thing about Pakistan and the university is that universities are being seen as the sites of the so-called fifth generation war, by which they mean that this is a war that's happening by manipulating the minds of young people. And naturally, when you're looking at the university as a site of a conspiracy, then it's no longer a place of dissent, of critical thinking, of discussing taboo topics. It's actually a war zone. And in a war zone, you can't allow too much dissent because there's the state of emergency. So the thinking of the university is now as the site where you have to impose this permanent state of emergency. The questioning of young people is immediately seen as part of this global conspiracy. And since our universities are so militarized and securitized, the response against students and professors who are critical is very swift and of course often very harsh. In places like Balochistan, it's incredibly harsh, where dozens and dozens of students have gone missing. Many of them have been found dead. And even this policy has come to places like Lahore and Karachi and Peshawar. But even beyond that, just the amount of suffocation that happens because of this environment, I think it's very, very dangerous. And recently Pervez Hudbay was also fired from FC College. This other professor at government college, Zagham Abbas, he was fired because he said something critical regarding our Kashmir policy, and he is from Gilgit. So this kind of targeting has happened over the past few years, and the challenge now for all of us is to not just fight for funding, not just fight for quality of education and ensuring of quality jobs, but also fight for the right to dissent on campuses and end the securitization. And I think these are the three big fights that will become increasingly important for young people in Pakistan and will determine what kind of a education system we have.
So what kind of time frame are we talking about here when you say that there's been a rising level, unprecedented levels of young people in higher education? Like what's the time span, and historically speaking, what is the reason for that? Is that linked to your argument about well, not your argument, but the statistical increase in urban and peri-urban living?
I think it's mostly this time period is Musharraf's period, which is a period of there's this brief period of prosperity, and there was a bubble when Pakistan joined the war on terror, and a lot of money poured into Pakistan, and they set up the Higher Education Commission, and which allowed these new departments and new campuses, and people were told that there's a future for you if you get into education. Now, unfortunately, that entire bubble collapsed in 2008, 2009. And since then, both Pakistan and the world has been in this perpetual crisis. And the only jobs that are left now that are stable are basically government jobs, CSS. And not even 1% of the youth can get that. So the private sector has collapsed. You have this youth bulge, large number of people who just don't have a place in society. And once that happens, young people start going from being assets to potential law and order problem. And I think young people are seen in Pakistan as a law and order problem. Increasingly, if you see a few young people sitting together somewhere, it's a crisis for everybody, especially if they happen to be women, but also men. And this kind of fear of the youth stems from the fact that we all consciously or subconsciously know that they don't have a future and they're angry. And rather than addressing the structural issues, the response, knee-jerk response, is one of securitized and militarized response.
I want to talk a little bit about uh, a recent lecture of yours. In fact, the most recent lecture of yours on Facebook, where you talked about neoliberalism and democracy. And so over here, I think we're zooming out a little bit in terms of political economy in Pakistan, right? And the places to which Pakistan has gone with regards to becoming a truly neoliberal state, um, a state that actually morally and materially invests in austerity, right? How long has that been going on in Pakistan in particular? And what kinds of that's the first question. But second, what kinds of particular flavors does it have, right?
What's happened is, on paper, interestingly, Pakistan is still a welfare state. I mean, Pakistan was never truly a welfare state, but on paper, its commitment has been there since the 73 Constitution. There's Article 3, which speaks against exploitation, actually speaks about the elimination of all forms of exploitation. Then you have right to education, right to health, right to housing. And you have all these labor institutions that were set up in the 70s and 80s to ensure that this welfare provided. What they've done in Pakistan is that since the onslaught of neoliberalism in the 1980s, they never kind of changed the policy or the laws in a way, in similar to what, in a way that we witnessed in Europe, for example. What they did is they simply stopped implementing labor law. So it's this weird abandonment and an active forgetting of this entire architecture of protection for the working class that existed and for the students. Even, for example, student unions. It is a constitutional right of students, and the Supreme Court judgment that is often invoked to deny students their rights. It clearly states that you need to bring a new framework soon to have student union elections. But there's an active forgetting of all of this entire framework, whether it's with trade unions, student unions, whether it's welfare schemes. There are all kinds of welfare schemes. For example, if someone works for 90 days anywhere, including at someone's house, they are supposed to become permanent employees, and they're according to law, and they're supposed to get all kinds of benefits, including gratuity and pension and death grant and all of this. But nobody knows about it. But in today's Pakistan, there's actually like a pervasive forgetting, and the way we interact in terms of work is simply, I would say, in a very feudal way. That we have a boss who's a feudal lord, and we have to be nice to them. There's no contract anymore. There's not been a legal erosion of the contract, but there's been a practical erosion. So de jure, there's still some good laws, but at the de facto level, we've eroded a lot. So that's one peculiarity of neoliberalism here in Pakistan. The other is that the state did not roll itself back in Pakistan, whether in terms of the securitization or in terms of capitalism. In fact, in today's Pakistan, you cannot imagine doing any form of business without being close to the state. And not just close to the state in terms of like buying congressmen, but also in terms of like actually raising money through the state for these massive investments. So the big projects right now, the way Pakistani capitalism is imagining itself is through CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a completely state-led project. It's basically, China's investments in Pakistan, which come through the state. So everybody who wants to make a buck out of CPEC has to be at some level connected to the state. So we have this state-led capitalism, which allows for all these contractors and builders and construction companies to get favors as long as you're connected to the state, because that's where the money is flowing from. We don't have the kind of independent bourgeoisie that of the Elon Musk kind. I mean, they're also subsidized in different ways, but we don't have them. We have people who are very much dependent on the state for the flow of capital, for the flow of goods, machinery, labor. All of that is very much connected to the state. What the state has done is it has entrenched itself within the economy while abandoning the working class. That's the kind of dual movement that we witnessed, and I think that's something that gives Pakistan its own peculiarity when it comes to neoliberalism, while sharing the same kind of global theoretical framework, which says the state should not take care of the public. That in that part, the Pakistani state is following the very classical, or neoclassical economics, but with its own kind of historical peculiarity, because without a strong state, capitalism in Pakistan will collapse.
So, I mean, that's interesting to me, because I think, when you spell it out that way, I actually feel like that makes Pakistan less peculiar, not more, because isn't that the nature of neoliberalism? So even in the US, for example, where you have state subsidies for everything from fossil fuel companies to pharmaceutical industries and et cetera, right? The state has entrenched itself. There's this idea that the state has rolled itself back, or there's some sort of decentralization that goes along with being a neoliberal state may actually, I'm not so sure it's true, because I do genuinely believe, and I brought up Karpolanyi with you before, but this idea that the free market, this thing that neoliberalism talks about, may very well be utopian, and it may very well not exist. And neoliberalism as it exists, and this is not exactly obviously the argument that he makes, but neoliberalism as it exists does not mean that the state has withdrawn in any necessary way.
Right. You're absolutely right. I think in that sense, that's why I said in terms of the subsidies, there's this commonality across the board, all over the world, that the state is actually subsidizing big capital. Our only difference is that we don't have large corporations who can cut their own deals or even bypass the state at a global level. So you don't have that. I mean, someone like Malik Riaz, for example, is completely dependent on the state, and they can destroy him in a way that might not be the same for, let's say, someone like Bill Gates. Or, I mean, you have this. I mean, that's part of the history of the bourgeoisie in peripheral regions, who were never confident enough to emerge as an independent class. And I think that becomes, it's a class that has to deal with feudals all the time. It has it's a class that has, so we never had, for example, the classical European fight between the bourgeoisie and the feudals, where the bourgeoisie defeated the feudals, and then you had this this civil society and the kind of democratic framework, liberal democratic framework. Here there was the bourgeoisie had to make a pact with the feudals in the 1940s and 50s, both in India and in Pakistan. And in Pakistan, another peculiarity was that even then they couldn't get their shit together, so they needed a very strong Bonapartist state. And initially, it was the civil bureaucracy that was maintaining this, peace between these classes, the ruling classes, and eventually it was the military that kind of put itself above the social strife and then started directing politics from there, which is why our neoliberalism is also, interestingly, extraordinarily militarized.
Mm.
And that then also links to the fact that because it's a neo-colonial or rentier state, it's also trying to cut deals with different global powers. Pakistan might be the only one of the few countries in the world that is getting bailouts from the IMF, China, and Saudi Arabia. I mean, Islam, capitalism, communism, everything. This is the kind of flexibility that the Pakistani state has vis-a-vis its own parceling out its own sovereignty. And yet, this is a state that also is willing to punish people for being foreign agents when everything is being run by foreign powers. And now, increasingly, you'll be surprised when we hear these stories that come out that different actors have started to cut different deals with different foreign players in Pakistan, and there's a lot of contestation over that. So it's a very dangerous. Recently Jodi Dean wrote something about neo-feudalism, and one of the arguments she was pushing was this like parceling out of sovereignty, and that's a very dangerous situation when you have different actors within society and within the state that are cutting deals with different global powers, and we're beginning to see that across Pakistan, which is very dangerous.
I think Bangladesh might be the other country that is getting aid from the IMF, China, and Saudi Arabia. Yeah.
We South Asians have been really good at like playing powers. We think we're the ones who are like fooling them. That's what we were thinking we were doing to East India Company. But
So, I mean, the discussing states like Pakistan, as neo-colonial is not new per se, but the usage of it has become a lot more common and a lot more, has been widely taken up quite a bit. I'm wondering as to, and this is more to like your theoretical training and, how you're thinking through theory as you're teaching, but what is the how have we moved past what we think of as the canon of post-colonial and or subaltern studies thinking, right? What are the new paradigms that we're operating in such that we are able to use words like neo-colonial and there is a certain understanding of what that means, a sort of communal understanding of what that means?
I still have a lot of sympathy for the post-colonial tradition. I wouldn't reject it completely. I think I think Marxists make a mistake when they pose very simplistic challenges to subaltern and post. What's that?
I agree with you.
Yeah, I think it's not that easy to dismiss. It's a if you have to critique it, and I think it ought to be critiqued precisely because it can be paralyzing politically at times. But it has to be critiqued. It still is a challenge to critique it because some really smart observations have been made. I mean, subaltern studies started off as an anti-imperialist project. I mean, that's its roots. It's a Maoist project initially, in the late 70s and early 80s, and it moved towards anarchism for a while, where they believed in a revolution without a party. So they were critical of CPM. So a critique of the West was very an integral part of the entire project, and that remained so till the end. A few things that I think we ought to maintain in our analysis, like things that we ought to, I think, appreciate within subaltern studies, is that there's certain situations in the colonial world that challenged the intellectual trajectory of modernity in the West. And that is not just true for things like, citizenship. And Dipesh has worked, Dipesh and Partha both have worked on it quite a bit, that, it's one of the key challenges for theorizing in Indian democracy is that the anti-colonial movement turns the peasant into a citizen without the pedagogical project that appeared in Europe in the 18th and 19th century. So you didn't have mass education or the ethos of being a citizen. All of a sudden, the anti-colonial movement, because of its own requirements of bringing the masses out on the streets, it produced a very, very different kind of a public sphere. Eventually, when India became a republic, it was the first kind of experiment in democracy. And the debates around the constitution in the late 40s are just amazing. I mean, Rohit has a book on it, which I find to be very interesting in that regard. Those debates are very interesting precisely because they know that something like this has not happened elsewhere. This kind of very skipping of stages, and this is also what Maoism was in many ways. The question of time is a central question for modernity.
Okay, so I want to circle back because we started talking initially about the state of political parties in Pakistan, and about the need to have an agenda as opposed to playing the politics of, of defensiveness, right? So, what's on the docket for HKM? What is the agenda as of this moment? And I guess this is a good day to ask you this question because we probably talked about it. But what is the agenda right now?
Well, we spoke to a number of political players in Islamabad. A lot of people are recognizing that there's vacuum in Punjab. Um, a lot of people are angry, and there's no political force at the moment that is channelizing that anger. We are in talks with political groups, but also internally to run in the local bodies elections, which may happen in a few months. It's a relatively easier election to contest because the size of the constituency is smaller, and could be a good testing ground for our own work on whether we've managed to win the confidence of communities where we worked in. So that's one. I think that's a very important avenue. On the other hand, in the long run, I think we have this kind of clarity that there has to be a politics premised on the concept of dual power, which basically means that we, of course, cannot completely abandon the electoral scene. You have to engage with the state, you have to grab power, which is why the kind of campaign that Bernie led or Corbyn in the UK was very inspiring, precisely because it allowed people to see a real alternative, and all of a sudden socialism wasn't as bad a word as it used to be. On the other hand, any such movement has to recognize that the system is incapable of representing the crisis. So when you're trying to get representation in parliament through elections, there are also things that can never be fully represented at the moment without battles on the street, which means police violence, which means sectarian violence.
I lost the last sentence.
Internal crises.
Can you repeat the last sentence?
Sorry, I said it's difficult for the system to represent all the coming crises, which includes these unemployment, which includes the climate catastrophe. Eventually, we would need a mass transformation, and it cannot happen without there being a mass movement on the ground. And in Pakistan, it becomes even more important because without street power, without the willingness to fight on the street, you'll either get killed by the religious right, or you can, even if you're a popular prime minister, you can be overthrown, your government can be overthrown, and you can be hanged. So we're dealing with a very violent state and society. So the organization has to be popular, it has to be disciplined, and it has to work both in terms of gaining power in existing institutions, but also building new institutions outside of the state. Workers' committees, students' committees. You have all these feminist groups that have emerged, peasant committees, um, uh, committees of ethnic minorities. That kind of those new forms of representation that can that can claim legitimacy in terms of their ability to mobilize the public, in terms of their ability uh, to fight those necessary fights that the state apparatuses are failing to fight, or the political parties are refusing to fight. I think without that kind of those new institutions emerging within society, it's very difficult to imagine transformation, because political party eventually, or any political organization, cannot realistically talk about a transformation that is completely divorced from what is actually happening on the ground. Which is also why I personally think social movements must work with political parties, but also be at a distance from them, because they also have the responsibility of pushing the discourse forward within the political sphere. And that new relationship between social and social movements and political parties, I think that dynamic has to be created. And right now, for the last few months or years, we've only focused on the social aspect. And for the first time, we're debating how to translate our work in society onto the political register, which means contesting elections, which means introducing new forms of new institutions with new forms of power relations, with new, like workers' committees. That's a very serious discussion that's underway with some workers' groups who are thinking of organizing outside existing trade unions, and more in terms of, and one of the it's a specific detail, but uh, trade unions usually here only organize full-time workers. The problem is that 80 to 90% of the workers in any factory are contract workers, part-time workers, and they're the most exploited workers, and there's no union for them. So they're thinking of,
and all that. Yeah.
What's that?
And there's domestic labor as well,
Yeah, absolutely, all of that. So I think organizing, without that kind of organizing, it will be very difficult to propose the kind of political changes or changes in political economy that we wish to see.
So, okay, so to end, do you feel like in terms of messaging these races are being run on, is it are they largely, as of this moment, um, messages of solidarity? And secondly, how good are you feeling about this? How optimistic are you feeling about the chances of success?
I have my good days and bad days. I mean, I think the bad feeling comes from the fact that if the state chooses to launch severe repression, then everything will become contingent, and we're not in a position to plan for it at the moment. And naturally, a lot of the young people who've entered the left are also my former students, and I'm particularly concerned about them, and that also stops me from uh, being my crazy self. Two of them were abducted last year, but we got both of them out. But one has to be very careful, because everybody is in a different situation, and people also have to have careers and earn and all of that, and one has to be very careful on how radical one tries to pose. And this is a very serious question that a lot of tiny groups don't care about because nobody's listening to them. But when we say something irresponsible, it can cost someone, a lot, and that one has to be cognizant of. On the positive side, I think um, more people are listening to the left than ever. That I saw anyway. Like from when I was, in my early 20s, we were the loony lefties. We still are, but just that more people are becoming, loony like us, and that's heartening. A lot of young people who feel that the ideological frameworks that were presented to them, they've collapsed. There's no narrative that the Pakistani state or the opposition can present to them that appears viable. There's this vacuum, ideological, intellectual vacuum that is really asserting itself, and in that we've kind of carved out a space for some kind of a new thinking on the left. And it's also different from the traditional left, which is often mimicking debates from the 1920s, which have very little relevance to the crises that we face today. So there's that, and the fact that you have a sharpening of class struggles across Pakistan, which you can see in, recently we were in Faisalabad, where 2,500 workers were fired by one of the most important industrialists in the city. They have this group called Ibrahim Fibers. 2,500 workers, and nobody in the past, nobody would have dared raise a word against it. This time, the workers did a number of protests, and then eventually they shut down the factory gates. We were there with them, and there was this lathi charge that happened, and people were beaten up. Many were arrested, and as soon as they came out, the next day they got their bail. They immediately did a press conference and said, we're going to continue with our protests. And now we're doing a protest with them on the 28th of September. So this kind of courage, this kind of steadfastness, I think it's coming. It both shows the intensity of the crisis, but also a shift in consciousness in which I think people have had enough. And you saw protests against the CCPO Lahore after the motorway incident, spontaneous and massive. You saw the student solidarity march. So things have been happening for a while now. And I think if these movements can come together, can speak to each other, I think a lot of new leaders will emerge. A lot of interesting ideas will emerge. And we might get to a point where the left starts appearing as a viable alternative on the national scale. And I think we should not be less ambitious than that. It is eventually, politics is a question of power. It is a question of transforming social relations, of transforming the state apparatus. And I think the left needs to stop thinking of itself simply as a group of resistance. It has to seriously address the question of power on a national scale. And I think people are beginning to do that, which I find very, very promising.
Thank you, Ammar, so much for taking out your time to talk with me and us. I know it's valuable time, but thank you so much.